I'm thinking about this term enlightenment, which I've spoken about before in these videos, in several ways really. Partly I've been talking about it as it's, well, just about the particularities of the term really, and its use of light as a metaphor for a kind of knowing. And I've also mentioned it in the way that it's used in spiritual and religious practices, and to a certain extent as a historical term for the various enlightenments, the various sudden moves forward in cultural and intellectual thought that took place 18th, 19th century again, in Western Europe certainly anyway. I'm thinking again about those terms, and I'm thinking about it partly in relation to this idea of spiritual enlightenment, and trying to tie it in, at least partially, to that other understanding, the other cultural, historical understanding of enlightenment. But certainly, if you read any modern spiritual enlightenment literature, well, most of it's just rubbish, I think. I mean, I just find it very deeply disappointing, most of the literature on enlightenment. Not because it's necessarily wrong, although I think most of it is wrong, but because most of it is kind of vague, I guess, or kind of obscurantist. And also because most of it harks to a certain understanding of enlightenment, which is associated pretty much exclusively with feeling. And there's nothing wrong with feeling. Again, I've spoken about that before, and I'll perhaps come back to it. But it seems to me that if we only associate enlightenment with a certain way of feeling, then we're limiting our understanding, and also setting up circumstances where the achievement of such a state, if that is possible, becomes more difficult or more hard to map. Certainly, it seems to me that one could easily say, yes, that person is enlightened, or I feel enlightened. You could kind of say that, and that would be different to saying that you know enlightenment. And I'm wondering why that's the case. And I think it's something to do with, this is purely hypothetical, I think it's something to do with the changing nature of epistemology and how we understand things, and the terms we give to things, in a sense. Maybe. Certainly a lot of the best historical writing on enlightenment, whether it be from whatever spiritual or poetic tradition it comes, it comes from Rumi or Eckhart, the Buddha, or some Vedic writings, or wherever it comes from, some Christian mystical writings, wherever it comes from, it certainly precedes the sort of 16th and 17th century move towards scientific thinking, and certainly precedes the cultural enlightenment of the 17th century, 18th century. So I'm just wondering whether the enlightenment that is being suggested or presaged or pointed at by historical mystical writers is really the same thing as the kind of understanding which characterizes post-enlightenment understandings of knowledge. Certainly somebody like Augustine, who I think most people would recognize as a mystical or spiritual or religious writer, not as something like that. When he's talking about a certain kind of enlightenment, in the sense of approaching God at least in his writings, I've got a Platonic Christian tradition, he talks about these three ways of seeing which approach the condition of God seeing as a kind of corporeal event, the act of just opening one's eyes and letting the images of the world flood in. Then he talks about spiritual seeing, which is the use of the memory and imagination, which he associates with real seeing. Actually, he says that corporeal seeing is real seeing. You don't really see something until you turn away from it and allow itself to impress itself on the memory. But then he says the third stage of seeing is intellectual seeing. He doesn't say somatic or emotional or I don't know, he doesn't use any of those sorts of terms. He's talking about intellectual seeing, which he associates with God and which he associates with sort of elevated viewing position. And as I say, he calls it intellectual seeing, which is a kind of depersonalized or interpersonal or extrapersonal or global or objective viewpoint outside of the restrictions and the limitations of the flesh. And I know there's a sort of pre-Cartesian dualism implicit in all that language, but I think that's just something I'll have to come back to later, I think. But the fact he's using intellection as a kind of enlightened state, to me hints at the idea that there's not such a big distinction between those two meanings of enlightenment as perhaps we sometimes think. I mean, the ability to think intellectually, the ability to think scientifically, objectively, to apply interpersonal validation methods for truth, all those kind of things, which are second nature now, which get taught to us in school, are really recent invention. Not really since Francis Bacon and Newton and Descartes and those guys did their work of that idea being part of the lingua franca of thought. Prior to that, presumably, the ability to think outside of oneself, to take the objective position, to be rational, was, in the way that we currently understand it, would be highly unusual, and particularly to be rational in a way which accords one's own rationality with the rationality of others. So it becomes a kind of collective rationality that one links one's own consciousness and one's own sensibilities to, which is hugely significant. Because of course we're not just linking one's own sensibilities to this interpersonal rationalism, you're also linking it to the stable facts of the world, the kind of rationality, the kind of objectivity which Francis Bacon starts to talk about in Nova Arcana and to become part of the scientific method. Here's, after all, Dawkins says, it's the poetry of reality. It's the collective vision of the stuff that doesn't go away when you stop looking at it, which is a highly unusual position. It is a highly unusual state and a highly amazing and profound idea, which I guess the 12th, 13th or earlier century thinker would be quite a revelation. I can imagine that as a real eye-opening, mind-expanding, world-exposing experience. And it's, in many ways, I think it would be a shame that we don't routinely grasp the strangeness of that position. The nearest we come to it is the kind of awestruck scientific, naturalistic theology, I guess, that you find in some science writings, which is kind of awestruck and all of those things. But I'm not sure that's the same thing. I think being gobsmacked by the amazing nature of the universe isn't the same thing as being intellectually, in a truly enlightened understanding of that term, intellectually engaged and embraced by that interpersonal, deeply felt rationalism.